I think it's time that we actually started looking at the bald realities of politics and the future of Scotland. Now, one of the first things I wanted to talk about today was Stephen Flynn MP, the Scottish, or the SNP's leader at Westminster, who appears to have recently taken a trip to Serbia and to Srebrenica as well, in the former war zone in the Balkans. Ostensibly, his trip was to look at the effects of an attempted genocide during the Balkans War and to see how people were recovering from it. Now, on the face of it, this seems a perfectly reasonable thing to do. But on the other hand, it seems like a junket. It also seems like a distraction from Mr. Flynn's mandated job at Westminster, which is to represent the interests of the people of Scotland, instead of which he's chosen to jet off across Europe on what seems to be a virtue signalling trip to show how concerned he is about the effects of genocide, which we all condemn and which everybody feels the same about. But why is he doing that when really he should be opposing Freeports, he should be opposing special economic zones, and more especially, he should be opposing what his Labour opposite number, Ian Murray, is up to in Scotland. Mr. Murray MP, who I think is now the Secretary of State for Scotland, if I remember correctly, because he was at one time the only Labour MP in Scotland, but has now been joined by some of his own party. But he's now been elevated to a position of power, and he's wasting no time at all in influencing Scottish affairs by bypassing Holyrood completely, and has been happily telling anybody in the English-owned media recently that he's spending, I think the number was something like £1.4 billion of our tax money in handouts to local authorities, completely bypassing Holyrood and making an irrelevance out of our national parliament. Now, why is he doing this? Well, we know that Kate Forbes, the finance secretary in the Scottish government, was recently quizzed in a public meeting about why she so readily jumped on board the whole Freeports bandwagon. And according to her, she had no choice in the matter. Now, she didn't elaborate how she had no choice, but I think reading between the lines, the fact that she is a part of the British managerial team in Scotland, which is basically doing the bidding of Westminster. And remember, her salary and the salaries of every MSP in Holyrood come directly from the British state, and devolution is a British creation. Then no, she didn't have any choice because she works for the British state, and her job was to try and sweeten the pill of the special economic zones and the Freeports by attempting to get the green paint out and paint over it, saying that whoever comes into these Freeports, whichever organisations or corporations are enticed into them, would have to satisfy the Scottish Parliament's demands for them to have things like a real living wage, to accept the principles of a just transition, whatever that might be, because we've never actually seen a definition of what that would be. In other words, greenwashing the whole thing to make it seem as if the Scottish Parliament has some influence over how these Freeports and special economic zones actually operate. But remember that the special economic zones and the Freeports are essentially annexed territories, which have been appropriated by the British state and given long leases, or in other words, the British state giving licenses to any corporation that wants to locate there, and enticing them with huge tax breaks and other major advantages which other companies outside of these special economic zones in Scotland will not have. Now, this means that large areas of Scotland's central belt and its coastal cities and ports, and its airports, incidentally, are essentially going to be given over to multinational corporations to run as they see fit, with minimal jurisdiction from the local authorities. So what Mr. Murray seems to be doing is giving out little handouts to the local councils, who are now powerless to do anything about the Freeports, in an effort to give them something to do, some involvement in this massive annexation of Scottish territories, to make it seem as though Scotland is going along with this. Now, coupled to that, we've also seen in the BBC in particular, but on mainstream media generally and in the newspapers, the presentation of John Swinney and his congratulatory message to Donald Trump, positioned alongside the other congratulatory message from the Welsh First Minister, as well as Keir Starmer's warm wishes as well, to try and present the United Kingdom as a happy triumvirate of nations where we all have our own leaders and they all welcome Donald Trump, etc., etc. So I think we can see now the way things are going to go for Scotland in the future. And it seems to me that all of this adds up to something rather unpleasant, which is that Scottish parties, either in Westminster, as in the SNP's Stephen Flynn, amongst others, and more close to home here in Holyrood, that all of these politicians that we have supposedly supporting Scotland have now been completely and utterly assimilated into the British political mess, this collective mythology that all of the major countries of the United Kingdom, that's Scotland, Wales and England, and remember Northern Ireland is only a tiny province, are all in cahoots here, and that we're all gung-ho for Donald Trump to be the President of the United States and to welcome any corporations that want to come into Scotland on the basis that they're going to have free rein to do what they like for the next, 20 years or so, regardless of the views and wishes of the local people who live in these areas. Now, as far as I can see, the only political parties who actually oppose these SEZs and these Freeports, as well as basically saying that they only exist for the purpose of obtaining Scottish independence, would be the Independence for Scotland Party, the ISP under its leader Colette Walker, and the New Scotland Party, which has been formed by the writer Peter Bell, both of which espouse direct democracy, the absolute power of Holyrood to decide whatever goes on in Scotland and the supremacy of that over any other outside influences. Colette Walker's own fight for the independence of the Scottish state extends also to the rejection of royalty and her request for Holyrood to pass new legislation which would change the oath which is sworn by Scottish MPs and MSPs. That was rejected in a bizarre and bafflingly contradictory statement by the SNP government. So all told, when I add all of this stuff up, what I'm seeing is a pattern of the sidelining of the Scottish electorate. At least 52% of the entire country is effectively being bulldozed aside as the British move into Scotland to take over its industrial future. And in the process, because we have now been alienated not only from the British state, which we already were anyway, but now we are being alienated from the parties nominally supporting independence, which are already elected. That leaves us with only two choices. In 2026, we either have to replace all of the government in Holyrood with one which is going to legislate full competence for the Scottish Parliament and then hold a confirmatory referendum on dissolving the Union, or we need to do this ourselves and take to the streets. Now that is a daunting prospect for any normal Scottish person, because like most of Europe, we are used to living in a stable, democratic, relatively safe space where we don't actually have to take any action physically ourselves to make anything happen. But I'm afraid that's changing now, and with all of the parties now stitched up and basically coming to heel according to the British masters, that leaves us with no independence parties, or nominally independence parties, left which we can count on to do the job. So I think it's going to be up to us to do the job, and that means 52% of the Scottish voting electorate are going to have to organise themselves and get on the streets. Now, there are many different ways that we could gum up the works and actually make sure that Scotland becomes ungovernable by the invading Freeport troops, if you like, in inverted commas troops. But this invasion of foreign companies and the forcing of them into our industrial complex against our wishes and taking over vast areas of our territory without by our leave and without permission given is something which nobody should tolerate. And least of all a country like Scotland, which has so much to still offer the rest of the world if it were independent. So that leaves us feeling rather powerless. But as we've seen in the United States in the last few days, once a charismatic and appealing leader appears, one who has a vision to make the changes that people demand, especially a majority of the people, then things can change. Whether you like Donald Trump or not, and whether you agree with his policies, or whether you admire him as a man or find him repugnant, doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is he managed to convince more than 50% of his own country to reject the status quo and go along with him with whatever he feels like doing. Now, personally, I don't want the Scottish Donald Trump. He also had the backing of the world's most wealthy man, Elon Musk, who actually campaigned in Pennsylvania for Donald Trump. And I suspect that, knowing Donald Trump as the transactional politician that he is, he's probably had a little quiet deal done with Mr. Musk to take the brakes off Musk's attempts to basically monopolize the entire space industry and to make sure that his Starship program, which is an amazing feat already in its own right, goes a lot more smoothly and with less bureaucratic red tape than it had before. So it may well be that Mr. Trump has already done a deal with Mr. Musk, and we might see things changing there. Now, Scotland doesn't have an Elon Musk, but Scotland must have somebody out there with enough charisma and the common sense to actually lead the people, a la William Wallace of old, who basically united the peasantry of Scotland, people who were not knights, who were not nobles, who were not powerful, into, well, a very effective fighting force back in those days. But what we need is a very effective political force, which is not party political, because party politics is plainly now completely stitched up and completely imprisoned within the United Kingdom system. And there's no way out of it unless the people do something about it. And this is what I was saying in my most recent programme, that the signs are all there now that Holyrood has now effectively been sidelined and has become an irrelevant talking shop, in order that the United Kingdom can produce some window dressing to show itself, apparently, to the rest of the world as some kind of multicultural, tripartite, three-country alliance where everybody has their own leader and every country can run its own affairs. But that is a lie. We all know that the United Kingdom is not run by its individual first ministers and prime ministers separately. It's run by London. It's funded from London. Both Wales and Scotland have to pay all their taxes to London and have a tiny proportion of it returned to them, with which they're expected to run their dwindling economies, whilst the English state forces these free zones upon any parts of these territories they feel like. So if you're dissatisfied with this invasion of foreign corporations, and if you agree, like me, that the Treaty of Union did not confer any territorial rights over Scottish resources to England, then you should be out on the streets as well. How this is going to happen, I really don't know, but honestly think that we are back to the stage we were at before Alex Salmond came to power in 2011. Now, for those of you saying, well, the world's in chaos, this is not the time to be fighting for independence, remember that when Alex Salmond did his magic in 2011 and got an outright majority in a parliament where it was supposed to be impossible, he did that against the backdrop of just coming out of a global banking crisis, which basically impoverished trillions of people across the planet and forced us all into austerity. And yet he still managed to rally more than 50% of the people of Scotland to support independence. before it was basically taken away by a lot of trickery and cheating by the United Kingdom. So if Salmon could do it during that period, when we were coming out of possibly one of the worst recessions of all time, then there's no reason why it can't be done right now. In fact, it's probably more pressing to do it right now, because while the world is in chaos, is a time when the bigger countries are not going to be keeping such a close eye on the smaller ones. And so getting things done might be easier for us now, while, say, Sir Keir Starmer is busy glad-handing the new president. Anyway, that's it from me today. I hope you've enjoyed today's programme. And just as a heads up, I'm now in talks with the Scotland channel to make Inde-Car a regularly timetabled programme 3 times a week, which will include, we hope, some new titles, some funding and monetization coming through the regular channeling of Inde-Car programs on the Scotland channel, which would mean, incidentally, if we can achieve it, that I would not have to keep asking people for donations, which is something I really hate having to do. Anyway, that's it from Inde-Car today. Keep faith with yourselves, and remember, now it's up to the people to decide what happens to Scotland. And 2026 is going to be the only opportunity we're going to get. But the British state can do a hell of a lot of damage in the next 2 years. And we need to remember there's going to be a lot of things getting worse before we can turn them around and make them better again. So I will probably be back on this channel umpteen times, unfortunately giving you more bad news about what is happening to us, even if it's already apparent to you. But we need to start thinking ahead about how we as people and individuals are going to organise ourselves and get out on the streets and actually stop the United Kingdom from governing Scotland. We want to make these annexed territories of these SEZs and Freeports ungovernable, unworkable, and make it as hard as possible within the law for the UK to achieve its aims here. Because really, we are talking about losing control of our entire manufacturing and business base, not to mention our importing and exporting base, to foreign corporations, something which we can't allow to continue. We've already allowed multinationals to seize all our natural resources, and now they're looking for multinationals to come in and to set up in Scotland. And you know what's going to happen. The whole purpose of these free ports is to force wages down, to create a small number of low-paid manufacturing jobs to try to compete with the low wages in developing countries. And that is going to create yet more austerity and more poverty and very few high-quality jobs whatsoever. I noticed that Kate Forbes could only predict, I think it was 350 new jobs being created in the Highlands and Islands over 10 years. And that was going to take billions of pounds worth of our money to achieve that. That is not a good return on our investment. Anyway, that's it from me. Keep the faith. I'll see you again later on Inde-Car. Bye bye for now.